So in this podcast, I'm just going to cover the objectives for Chapter 5, Learning. We will be discussing what is meant by the term learning, at least what we mean in terms of a psychological definition of the way that individuals learn. And you're going to see that it breaks down into different categories of how learning occurs. So the first that we're going to be looking at is classical conditioning. So you're going to want to be able to describe and explain how classical conditioning started, the origins of it, and what are its important elements. And so this is the work of Pavlov and his dogs. And so you're going to see some of the video clips from that in this week's readings and videos in Revel. So hopefully the videos will help sort of show how this all works. But classical conditioning has different elements to it, or different parts that are distinguished and help to understand what phases of learning are occurring at what different times. So you're going to be talking about things like the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, and then the conditioned response and the unconditioned response. So classical conditioning basically just posits that conditioning happens. We are conditioned to understand the association between things. When you pair one thing with another thing and you do it enough times, the person or the organism learns that those two things go together. And they learn to expect that those two things will go together. So you're going to see the classical studies of Pavlov with his dogs, using a bell to condition a dog to salivate to a bell rather than to just food. Okay, and so the key thing you always want to be keeping in mind is that there are elements that happen naturally that an animal or a person does not need to be conditioned to do. They just do, like salivating for food. If you present a dog with a bone or a piece of meat or something tasty, they will naturally start salivating. They'll start drooling. If it's like my dog, these long drools that come off. No one's conditioned the dog to do that. It's just a biological event that happens naturally, okay? Now, a dog wouldn't do that to a bell, right? A bell ringing doesn't make a dog want to salivate. But if you pair that bell with the food enough times, where you're doing bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, pretty soon that animal learns that, oh my gosh, the bell just rang. That means I'm getting food. And they will salivate because the expectation is that food's coming. So they salivate to the bell with the expectation that food is coming. So that's the basic gist of it. And you can twist that around and you can figure out how many different scenarios can play out where that same type of process is happening, right? If I jiggle my keys, that signals to my animal that we're going to go for a walk. Jiggle my keys, normally the animal wouldn't care less. Okay, you jiggled your keys, no big deal. But if I jiggle my keys and take the dog on a walk, jiggle my keys and take the dog on the walk, and I do that enough times, the animal learns that association. The jiggling of the keys means I'm going for a walk. And pretty soon you jiggle your keys and the animal's getting all excited because they know what's coming next. So hopefully that helps clear up a little part of the process. Just practice with it, play around with it a lot, and get comfortable with the different elements that are outlined in the chapter. It will also talk about conditioned emotional responses and how we can have an emotional response to something, but that it's conditioned. We're sort of trained to respond that way to that thing. As well as with taste. Sometimes we have conditioned taste aversions. We tried something and it was paired with something negative, and now every time we taste that thing, we think of what it was paired with, and we develop an aversion towards it. I have this issue with ginger ale because I used to drink ginger ale when I was pregnant. You're told to, eat ginger or drink ginger ale and it will make your stomach feel better when you have morning sickness. But the problem is that I began to associate ginger ale with being sick. And so even now when I go to taste ginger ale, I kind of think back to being sick and I kind of have like an aversion to it. So that'll be talked about a little bit too in the chapter, those taste aversions. Then you're going to be looking at operant conditioning and how it differs from classical conditioning. And these are the contributions of Thorndike and Skinner developed this area of operant conditioning. And it works on contingencies, rewards versus punishments. Like when we're rewarded for a behavior, we're more likely to do it. When we're punished for a behavior, we're less likely to do it. So instead of working on associations between things, it's more like the resulting condition of something due to my behavior. And so you'll learn about some of the intricacies of that. What are primary reinforcers? What are secondary reinforcers? And what do we mean by positive and negative reinforcement? There's just different types of reinforcement that we can give, and the effect is different based on what we give. And there are different schedules of reinforcement. So we can choose to reinforce every time we do something, or we can choose to reinforce maybe every other time, or every 10th time, or maybe every hour, or every day. So the schedule of time can be a reinforcement, and the schedule of the number of times it happens can be a reinforcer. And so then we're going to take all of that and we're going to contrast it with punishment. How is it different from punishment? And what are some of the problems associated with using punishment as a guide for learning? Is it effective? Is it not effective? And why? And what might be the role of different stimuli in the environment that might be coming into play to control behavior and might enhance or limit operant conditioning, because really it depends on what's happening in our environment too that can affect how we learn. And so all of this to say, how can operant conditioning be used to change an animal or human behavior? And what might be some limitations. So a lot of times we think of operant conditioning in terms of kids, in the educational setting. We give out stickers when they do a good job, or, a check mark every time you, get a worksheet right. Well, those are all reinforcers, right? Those are all operant conditioning. Those are positive reinforcers. You're giving something in hopes that the child learns that, oh, when I do this thing, I get rewarded. And that's great. I'm going to keep doing this thing in hopes of getting that reward. So there's some really good elements to it of how it can be used beneficially in many different domains. And then there's obviously some limitations. Then we'll look at the concept of latent learning. This is sort of like the brain has learned to do something, but it doesn't appear till later. You don't really see it until later. And then it's like all of a sudden it clicks. It's related to insight learning. And that insight learning is like kind of like the aha moment. You learned something before and your brain stored it, but you really just couldn't access it until all of a sudden that light bulb goes off and you're like, oh, I got it. And it kind of all finally comes together. That's sort of insight learning. Also, we'll look at learned helplessness, how we develop a pattern of behavior where we kind of learn to be defeated. Learned helplessness is learning that like no matter what we do, it doesn't matter. And this is linked to depression. It's linked to feeling like you failed and giving up. When we cannot control our environment or the things around us, we start to think that, well, nothing I do is going to matter anyways, so why try? And we fall into this like learned helplessness. And then the last type of learning that you're going to be looking at is observational learning, and this is the work of Bandura. We want to kind of look at what that process is. There are 4 elements of observational learning that are outlined in the book. Be familiar with what those are. And how does observational learning occur in the real world? What might be some settings where we would see this happening. And so definitely for this chapter, as you're reading through it, you want to be watching the videos that are in Revel, which are going to help illustrate a lot of these concepts and give you some more sort of real world examples to help guide your understanding of the material. So don't skip over those. Make sure that you're watching those, and then also make sure that you're watching the videos that I posted.